Imagine a father, a police officer, coming home after years of service, only to find his children crying in the rain and the door of his own house slammed shut. What would you do if everything you believed in was taken from you in one night? This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about resilience, about a man who fought not with anger, but with love, to win back his family's future. Stay with me, because what unfolds will move you in ways you don't expect. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know. And from my heart to yours, I wish you a truly wonderful day. The rain fell heavy upon the quiet streets of Ashford, Vermont, a small New England town where autumn usually painted the maples gold and crimson. Tonight, however, the leaves plastered to the pavement beneath a torrent that turned gutters into rushing streams and rooftops into echoing drums. The lampposts along Main Street glowed faintly through veils of water, their halos blurred like fading lanterns in a storm. It was here, on the corner of Willow Lane, that Daniel Harris returned home after a grueling stretch of months spent patrolling the highways and back roads of the county. Daniel Harris, 37 years old, stood tall with the posture of a man trained by years in uniform. Broad-shouldered and built on hard muscle, he had a face weathered not by war abroad, but by the countless storms of policing small-town America. Meth houses, domestic disputes, missing children in forests. His hair was chestnut brown, cropped short, but streaked with silver at the temples, and his hazel eyes carried a weight that often seemed older than his age. He was not a man given easily to anger. His strength was in patience, in listening, in enduring. Yet there was always a quiet loneliness about him since his foster father passed away 2 years earlier. A mentor who had taught him dignity and discipline, who left him a sense of duty carved into his very bones. By his side trotted Rook, his 6-year-old German shepherd. Rook was large for his breed, with thick black and silver fur that shimmered even in the rain, and amber eyes bright with alertness. His ears stood sharply, tail swaying like a metronome of vigilance. Rook had been with Daniel since his first years on the force, a gift from his late foster father, who believed every man needed both loyalty and companionship. The dog bore a small scar over his left flank from a scrape with barbed wire during a pursuit years ago, and though it healed, it gave him an air of rugged resilience. Calm around children, fiercely protective when danger loomed, Rook was both guardian and silent partner in Daniel's life. The modest house on Willow Lane looked different than when Daniel had left. The porch light burned not with welcome, but with an almost surgical brightness, exposing the shadows of 2 small figures standing uncertainly in the doorway. Eli and Grace, his 7-year-old twins, had their mother's blonde hair, but their father's wide-set eyes. Eli, tall for his age, often carried himself like a little protector, while Grace, smaller, was tender-hearted and quick to cry when the world seemed cruel. Both children now looked frightened, their pajamas clinging wet against their skin from the drizzle, their small hands clutching one another as if holding on for survival. And then there was Claire. Claire Whitmore Harris, once a woman Daniel thought gentle and steadfast, now stood with hard lines cut into her beauty. She was 35, of medium height, her once soft curves tightened by an obsessive devotion to Pilates and appearances. Her hair, once a warm honey, was now streaked with icy blonde highlights, a reflection of her growing fixation with status and image. Claire had not always been this way. Once, she had been the girl who stayed up late to help Daniel study for his academy exams, the woman who sang softly while folding baby clothes. But somewhere along the way, years of loneliness, phone calls cut short, nights spent waiting by herself, resentment simmering, had hardened her. She carried herself now with a sharpness, a disdain that made her voice cut like glass. Daniel stepped forward, rain streaming from the brim of his Navy patrol cap, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He had imagined this reunion in quiet moments during long night shifts, believed that after endless patrols and courthouse testimonies, he would find solace in the laughter of his children and the embrace of his wife. Instead, he was met with the sight of a suitcase hurled onto the porch, clothes spilling out like entrails. Claire's hand, still gripping the doorframe, trembled not with fear, but with anger. "You're not welcome here anymore, Daniel," she said, her voice steady, almost rehearsed. "You and them Take your things and go." The words pierced him more cruelly than any bullet ever could. He glanced at the children, who looked back with confusion, their lips trembling. Grace clutched her old stuffed rabbit, one ear torn and stitched clumsily by Daniel months ago. Eli pressed against Daniel's leg, eyes searching for assurance that their world was not shattering. Daniel tried to keep his voice level. "Claire, it's pouring out here. The kids are scared. Let's go inside, talk this through." His tone carried restraint, the kind that had calmed countless quarrels between neighbors, but it cracked slightly under the weight of disbelief. Claire's laugh rang harsh, a sound he barely recognized. "Talk? I've been talking to shadows for years. You were never here, Daniel. You chose that badge over us every single time." Rook stepped forward, fur bristling, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His amber eyes fixed on the figure standing just behind Claire, inside the doorway. Marcus? Marcus Bell was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with the slicked-back black hair of a man who cared too much about mirrors and too little about conscience. His sharp cheekbones and perfectly pressed shirt gave him a veneer of success, though the glint in his gray eyes carried the smug cruelty of someone who thrived on taking what belonged to others. Marcus had a history in Ashford, once a local real estate agent whose deals had always seemed just a little too convenient, always skirting the line of legality. Daniel knew of him, had even fielded complaints about his shady dealings, but never had cause to press charges. Now, Marcus stood with folded arms, leaning casually in the frame, his smirk a dagger twisting in. Daniel's gut. The rain intensified, beating down like a gavel against the roof. Claire's hand tightened on the door. "You have 1 hour to take whatever's left and get out," she snapped. With that, she slammed the door shut, the metallic click of the lock final and merciless. Daniel dropped to his knees on the porch, the weight of the moment pressing him down. Through the frosted glass of the door, Marcus's silhouette remained, arms crossed, head tilted in satisfaction. The small red light of the doorbell camera blinked, recording the humiliation, preserving it forever. Eli tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, what did we do wrong?" His voice was a trembling whisper, fragile, innocent. Daniel's heart fractured. He wrapped his arms around both children, pulling them close, feeling their tiny bodies shiver against him. Grace sobbed into his chest, muffled by the fabric of his uniform. Rook pressed against his side, warm and solid, a silent shield against the cruelty of the night. He whispered into their hair, "You did nothing wrong. This isn't your fault. I'll keep you safe." His words were a vow, a prayer, a lifeline thrown into the storm. Behind them, the suitcase soaked in the rain. Grace's stuffed rabbit slipped from her grasp, tumbling into a puddle where its stitched ear floated like a shipwreck. Daniel rose to his feet, clutching his children tighter, his duffel digging into his shoulder. He turned away from the house that no longer was his home, stepping off the porch into the night. Rook followed, ears perked, glancing back once as if memorizing the enemy within. As Daniel carried Eli and Grace down the street, their small figures blurred by rain, the door creaked open once more. Marcus's face appeared in the glow of the porch light, lips curling into a crooked smile, a predator savoring victory. The storm swallowed the Harris family whole, their silhouettes fading into the dark curtain of water, leaving behind nothing but the cold light of a house no longer theirs. The rain had not let up when Daniel Harris guided his old pickup truck through the narrow back streets of Ashford. The wipers struggled against the downpour, streaking his view with watery arcs, and every few seconds the headlights cut across pools of water that rippled like broken mirrors. In the cab, Eli and Grace huddled against him, their damp pajamas clinging to their skin, while Rook sat in the back, his thick fur darkened, but his posture alert, ears twitching to every sound outside. The heater worked weakly, puffing a breath of lukewarm air, but it was not enough to warm the fragile bodies of the children pressed close to their father. Daniel drove aimlessly at first, unwilling to admit that he had no destination, only an urgent need to find safety. His chest ached with each sob from Grace, each whisper from Eli, asking why they had been thrown out. The questions he could not answer clawed at him harder than the rain on the windshield. The town gave way to outskirts where the streets widened into lonely stretches flanked by skeletal trees. At last, Daniel pulled into the cracked parking lot of an abandoned church, its wooden steeple leaning like a weary sentinel against the storm. The stained glass windows were broken, shards scattered across the ground like forgotten prayers. It was not a home, but it was shelter. He turned off the engine, and silence rushed in, heavy and damp, broken only by the distant groan of thunder. "Daddy, are we going to sleep here?" Eli asked, his voice brave but trembling at the edges. Daniel forced a calm smile. "Just for tonight, champ. Tomorrow we'll find somewhere better." He reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, pulling Grace into his arms while Eli curled up against his side. Rook shifted to the front, laying across the floor mats, his amber eyes watching both the children and the shadowed windows beyond. The dog let out a low, steady breath, like a guardian easing them into uneasy rest. Hours passed slowly. Rain became a lullaby of despair. At one point, Grace stirred and whispered that her rabbit was gone, left behind on the porch. Daniel held her closer, whispering that she had Rook now, and Rook gave a soft chuff, as if to confirm. Exhaustion overcame the children at last, their breaths sinking in rhythm against Daniel's chest, while he sat awake, staring into the darkness. It was nearly dawn when the harsh buzz of his phone broke the silence. The caller ID read Vincent Morales. Daniel hesitated, then answered, his voice hoarse. Vincent was a fellow officer he had once trained alongside, a man in his late 30s with the build of a linebacker and the steady eyes of someone who had learned to measure every word. His short black hair was streaked with early gray, and though he carried himself with discipline, those who knew him well understood he had a soft heart hidden beneath the armor. Years before, during a tense standoff in a farmhouse, Daniel had pulled him out after Vincent took a shotgun pellet to the leg. Their bond since then had been quiet but unbreakable. "Dan, where the hell are you?" Vincent's tone was edged with worry. "Word got around you're back in town. Heard things. Didn't sound good." Daniel hesitated. Pride threatened to silence him, but exhaustion won. "I'm with the kids. We've got nowhere to go." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken fury on Vincent's end. "Stay put. I'm coming." 15 minutes later, headlights swept across the church parking lot. Vincent's black pickup pulled in, and he stepped out, rain soaking through his brown leather jacket. When he reached Daniel's truck and saw Eli and Grace curled asleep, his jaw clenched. He cursed softly, shoved a wad of bills into Daniel's hand, and shook his head. "This isn't right. You need work. You need someone to watch the kids while you pull yourself up. I know a place." Daniel followed his friend's lead. The children bundled into Vincent's truck, with Rook close behind. They drove across the older district of Ashford until they reached a weathered brick building that once might have been a neighborhood schoolhouse. The paint peeled in strips, the sign over the door faded, but a warm glow of light spilled from the entrance. Inside waited Martha Reynolds, a woman in her late 60s who had run a small daycare for decades. Martha was stout and slightly stooped, her hair pulled back into a bun that always unraveled by day's end. Her face was lined not only with age, but with years of listening, scolding, laughing, and wiping away tears of other people's children. Her soft brown eyes, though weary, still carried sparks of kindness. Widowed young, she had poured her life into caring for children when her own son had died tragically in a car accident. That wound never healed, but it deepened her compassion. When Vincent introduced Daniel and the twins, Martha did not ask many questions. She simply crouched down to Grace and Eli's level, offering them a smile that crinkled her cheeks. "You'll be safe here, sweethearts," she said. Her voice was raspy but gentle, carrying the weight of someone who understood pain, yet refused to let it harden her. Grace clung shyly to Daniel's leg, but Eli took her hand cautiously, sensing the sincerity in her eyes. Martha agreed to take them in by the hour for a fee Daniel could barely afford, but she waved off his apology. "I've seen plenty of fathers do less with more. You'll find your way. For now, let them be children." With that assurance, Daniel left his kids in Martha's care, Rook staying loyally at his heel as he walked back into the rain with Vincent. His old friend had already lined up a temporary shift at a local repair garage run by a gruff man named Henry Caldwell. Henry, in his late 50s, was a wiry figure with oil permanently embedded under his nails and a permanent squint in his sharp, blue eyes. He rarely spoke more than a grunt, but he respected hard work. He had once been a veteran of factory floors until automation stripped away his livelihood, and bitterness lingered beneath his terse demeanor. Still, when Vincent vouched for Daniel, Henry nodded. Show up early, work late, don't complain, you'll get your pay. And so began a brutal rhythm. Days blurred into each other as Daniel split himself between 12-hour shifts under Henry's watchful eye and late nights searching for a place to live. His hands, once used to gripping the weight of his duty belt, now blistered under wrenches and greasy bolts. He often returned to the daycare with aching muscles, only to find Grace proudly showing him a paper drawing, or Eli recounting how Rook had spent hours playing guard outside the play yard. Those small moments became fuel against the grinding despair. After a week of this relentless cycle, Daniel finally scraped together enough for the deposit on a basement apartment in a crumbling complex near the river. The walls smelled of mildew, the carpeting was threadbare, and the only furniture left behind was a sagging couch and a rickety dining table. But, to Grace and Eli, it was a castle compared to nights in the truck. Rook sniffed every corner of the new space, circling before, laying heavily across the doorway, his presence turning that basement into something resembling a home. That night, as Daniel tucked the children into makeshift bedding, Eli whispered, "We're safe now, right, Dad?" Daniel nodded, brushing his son's damp hair from his forehead. "Safe," he said, though his own heart knew this was only the beginning of a longer battle. Grace drifted to sleep, clutching a pillow Rook had been lying on, comforted by the scent of their guardian. Daniel sat awake long into the night, the dim bulb flickering overhead, listening to the rain ease into silence. His notebook lay open before him, already filled with neat lines of expenses: rent, daycare, milk, bread. It looked less like a budget and more like a soldier's battle plan. He gripped the pen tightly, drawing strength from the soft breaths of his children in the next room and the steady rhythm of Rook's breathing by the door. Tomorrow would demand more of him, but tonight they had survived, and survival, for now, was enough. The following week in Ashford felt like a blur of damp mornings and long nights. Autumn's chill had begun to bite more sharply, and in the basement apartment by the river, the thin walls rattled with the groan of the heating pipes that barely worked. The air smelled faintly of mildew and rust, but to Eli and Grace it was a fortress compared to the church lot. Their laughter, when it came, bounced off the concrete walls like fragile music, a reminder that children could find light even in shadows. Daniel woke before dawn every day, rising quietly from the old couch so as not to disturb the twins sleeping in their improvised beds. His uniform was now grease-stained coveralls from Henry's garage, the fabric stiff from days of work. The blisters on his hands had become calluses, his arms sore from lifting engines, but he forced himself into the rhythm. Rook, ever faithful, slept curled by the door, ears pricking at every sound from the hallway. When Daniel stood to lace his boots, Rook stretched, shook his fur, and followed him out, ready to guard the apartment in his absence, or accompany him to work if needed. One evening, as Daniel returned home with a bag of day-old bread from the discount bakery, he found his downstairs neighbor sitting on the cracked steps. Sarah Bennett was a woman in her early 40s, tall and angular, with short-cropped auburn hair that framed a face lined by hardship. She wore a patched denim jacket and held a sketch pad on her knees, though her pencil hardly moved. Sarah had once been a painter. Her small apartment was filled with canvases leaning against walls, but after a fire destroyed her studio and took her partner's life years ago, she had retreated into near solitude. She spoke little to neighbors, often misunderstood as cold, yet beneath her guarded exterior was a quiet empathy. She glanced at Daniel and the children, her eyes softening. "They're holding up," she asked, nodding toward Eli and Grace, who clutched his hands tightly. Daniel hesitated, then offered a tired smile. "They're tougher than me sometimes." Sarah looked at Rook, who had stepped closer, sniffing her cautiously. She reached out slowly, letting him decide, and Rook, after a pause, leaned into her hand. "Dogs know," she murmured. "They know who needs protecting." It was a simple exchange, but one that settled into Daniel's mind. That night, while the twins colored on scraps of paper at the rickety table, Sarah slipped a set of crayons through their door with a quiet knock. Grace squealed with delight, and Eli whispered, "Maybe she's not so scary." A new ally had quietly entered their fragile circle. Days at the garage stretched Daniel thin. Henry Caldwell, gruff as always, pushed him hard, barking instructions that echoed through the greasy bays. Henry rarely praised, but one afternoon, when Daniel managed to rebuild a transmission faster than expected, the older man gave a grunt that was almost approval. Still, Daniel knew this work alone would not keep them afloat. At night, when the twins were asleep and Rook rested his head on Daniel's boots, he opened his foster father's envelope again. The iron key inside felt heavy, not just in his palm, but in its promise. He traced its grooves, wondering what door it was meant to open. What secret might still wait? One Saturday morning, Daniel decided to explore. He brought the children and Rook to his foster father's old farmhouse, long since abandoned at the edge of town. The place had been shuttered after his death, its windows boarded, its fields left to weeds. Daniel remembered summers spent here as a boy, helping mend fences, listening to his foster father's gravelly voice telling him that dignity was the only wealth a man should never lose. Now the farmhouse stood like a relic, its silence unsettling. Grace clung to Rook's fur, her blue eyes wide. "It's spooky, Daddy." Eli, braver, tried to push the door, but it groaned shut. Daniel reached for the old lock and with trembling hands slid the iron key inside. The mechanism resisted, then clicked with a finality that made his heart pound. The door creaked open to reveal dust-thick air and a room littered with forgotten furniture. In the corner, beneath a faded quilt, sat a trunk. Its brass fittings tarnished, but the initials carved into it were unmistakable. He pulled it into the light. Inside were folders of documents, photographs, and letters. The smell of paper long sealed filled the air. Eli and Grace leaned in, curious, while Rook sniffed at the edges, tail wagging softly. Daniel lifted one letter, the handwriting firm, the ink faded. It spoke of his foster father's involvement in a company called Apex Dynamics, of shares left untouched, of a legacy meant not as wealth, but as responsibility. Daniel's hands shook. He closed the trunk quickly, heart racing. The twins were watching, too young to understand, but he knew this was no ordinary inheritance. This was the means to change their fate, though at what cost, he did not yet know. He locked the farmhouse again, whispering to himself that he was not ready. Not yet. That evening, back at the basement apartment, Sarah knocked gently on their door. She held out a loaf of fresh bread. "The market throws out plenty," she said matter-of-factly, though her cheeks colored slightly, betraying her shyness. Grace beamed, and Eli invited her in. She declined, but crouched to pat Rook's head, murmuring, "You keep them safe." Rook's tail thumped the floor in steady agreement. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a fragile network forming. A dog's loyalty, a neighbor's quiet kindness, a friend's unwavering support. It was not much, but it was something. As night fell, the children drifted into sleep, their bellies full, their hearts a little lighter. Daniel sat by the flickering bulb, staring at the notebook filled with expenses. Every line was another battle, every page a reminder that survival was not enough. He thought of the trunk, the shares, the strange weight of wealth he had not asked for. Yet tonight, with his children breathing steadily and Rook guarding the door, Daniel allowed himself a sliver of peace. Ashford's mornings had grown sharper, the first frost of October silvering the grass along the riverbanks and painting breath into the air. In the basement apartment, Daniel Harris stirred awake to the rattle of the old pipes and the muffled chatter of his children, who were already up, arguing cheerfully over whose turn it was to pour cereal from the box. Rook stretched at the door, his black and silver coat catching the dim light, his amber eyes calm but alert as always. The faint warmth of domestic life tried to settle in the small space, but Daniel's thoughts remained elsewhere, on the trunk in his foster father's abandoned farmhouse, and the weight of secrets it held. That day after work, when the children were with Martha at daycare, Daniel drove back out to the farmhouse. The weeds had grown higher, whispering against the fenders of his truck, and the boards across the windows groaned in the wind. He carried the iron key in his pocket, as though it anchored him. Inside, dust swirled in pale shafts of light that leaked through cracks in the wood. He knelt before the trunk again, Rook at his side, ears perked as though sensing the gravity of the moment. He opened folder after folder, stock certificates bearing the name Apex Dynamics, ink, lay neatly preserved, their numbers staggering. Letters described disagreements between his foster father and a former partner who wanted to sell. And there were notes, warnings that one day, the shares might draw out opportunists, people who would see Daniel not as a man, but as a target. It wasn't just money. It was a battlefield, hidden in paper. Daniel closed the trunk, heart hammering. He was not ready to expose his children to a war of lawyers and leeches, but he copied down account numbers, signatures, details, proof to keep close. He tucked them into a small folder and locked the trunk again, whispering to his foster father's memory, "I'll use it when the time's right." On the way back, he stopped at the small library near Main Street, a building of red brick and worn columns. Inside, rows of shelves carried the smell of ink and dust, and the librarian, Agnes Monroe, a woman in her 70s with thin spectacles and snow-white hair, peered at him curiously when he asked for records of Apex Dynamics. Agnes was thin, tall, with a posture still sharp despite age. Known for her no-nonsense attitude, she had spent decades curating the town's archives, a kind of gatekeeper of local memory. She fetched him old news clippings without a word, but as she handed them over, her eyes softened. "Your father? He was a good man," she said quietly, recognizing the name. Daniel nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Meanwhile, life in the basement unfolded in small rhythms. Grace proudly taped her drawings to the cracked walls, and Eli practiced reading aloud from borrowed library books. Sarah Bennett, their neighbor upstairs, continued her quiet kindness. Some evenings, she would leave bread or fruit outside their door. Once she gave Grace a faded but beautiful watercolor set she had never touched since the fire years ago. The children grew fond of her, and Sarah, though awkward, slowly allowed herself to sit at their table sometimes, her long frame hunched slightly as she watched Eli and Grace chatter. Her eyes often glistened, as though being near their innocence was both healing and painful. One evening, Sarah asked about the farmhouse. Daniel hesitated but told her pieces, how his foster father had left him something important, something that could change their future. Sarah listened, chin resting in her hand, her gaze steady. "Money can save," she said softly, "but it can also devour. Promise me you'll use it for them, not against anyone else." Her words struck him with a strange authority, as though she, scarred by loss, had learned truths he had not. Work at the garage remained grueling. Henry Caldwell barked instructions, his wiry frame somehow commanding the younger men. Daniel endured, but one afternoon a new worker appeared, Kyle Sanders, a 22-year-old with lanky limbs, pale hair that flopped into his eyes, and a restless energy. Kyle had grown up bouncing between foster homes, carrying the bitterness of someone who had always been discarded. Quick with his hands but quicker with his temper, he clashed with Henry often. Yet when he saw Daniel's patience, he grew oddly respectful, shadowing him, asking questions. Daniel recognized the boy's hunger for guidance and offered small lessons, the way his foster father once had with him. Rook, lying at the bay entrance, seemed to sense the boy's unease, sometimes padding over to rest his head against Kyle's leg, grounding him. It was a small act, but Daniel noticed how Kyle's sharpness softened each time. A subplot of mentorship was quietly forming, though neither of them named it. Back in the basement apartment, Daniel's nights were consumed by planning. He listed expenses in neat rows, calculated what he could save, and beneath it all, wrestled with the choice of revealing the inheritance. More than once he caught Eli staring at him, brow furrowed, and Grace asking, "Why are you always writing, Daddy?" He would smile and say, "I'm drawing a map so we can find our way home." They didn't understand, but it reassured them. One night, after tucking them in, he sat by the dim light with Sarah across from him, the watercolor set open on the table. Grace's attempts at painting had smeared the colors into a storm of pinks and blues. Sarah studied it quietly, then said, "You know, broken things can make new pictures too." Daniel glanced at her, realizing she wasn't just speaking of paint. The weeks passed, frost giving way to the first hints of winter. Daniel carried on, torn between survival and the heavy knowledge in his folder, but for the moment he held his children close, let Sarah's quiet strength buoy him, and allowed Rook's watchful presence to remind him that not all battles required weapons. Some required patience and love and the endurance to wait for the right moment. And so, the legacy remained hidden. For now. While Daniel Harris struggled quietly to build a life from the basement apartment in Ashford, another household across town was beginning to unravel. The house on Maple Grove, once the pride of Claire Whitmore Harris, seemed at first glance immaculate. Trimmed hedges, a glossy black SUV in the driveway, and the glow of modern chandeliers spilling from its wide windows. Yet inside, the polish was beginning to crack. Claire stood in front of a gilded mirror in the bedroom, her icy blonde hair pinned into loose waves, a silk blouse draped over her narrow shoulders. Her reflection looked perfect, but her hands trembled as she sorted through a stack of credit card bills on the dresser. The balances were higher than she remembered, and the red overdue stamp across one envelope sent a shiver through her. She was 35, still beautiful, but lines of fatigue had begun to etch around her eyes. For years she had craved a life of security, a step above the weary loneliness of being married to a policeman who was rarely home. She thought she had found that in Marcus Bell. Marcus, however, was no savior. At 42, he had the air of a man who thrived on appearances, his slicked-back hair never out of place, his tailored suits a constant, his smile sharp and practiced. But beneath the veneer was a restless cruelty. He was quick to charm, but quicker to sneer, dismissing anyone he considered beneath him. His gray eyes carried calculation, and his voice, smooth in public, turned cutting in private. That evening, Marcus paced the living room, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low but heated tones. "No, I said I'd have it covered. Just give me another week. Don't threaten me." He slammed the phone down, muttering curses. Claire appeared at the doorway, clutching the bills. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear. "My card was declined today at the boutique. You told me not to worry." Marcus shot her a glance, irritation flashing across his face. "It's a system glitch. Stop dramatizing." Claire pressed, her voice rising. "Don't lie to me, Marcus. We're out of money, aren't we?" His jaw tightened. He stepped closer, towering over her, placing a hand heavy on her shoulder. His tone turned cold, each word deliberate. "Don't question me. I said I'll fix it." Claire felt the weight of his control pressing down, the dream she had chosen unraveling strand by strand. She thought of Eli and Grace, their innocent eyes, and for a fleeting moment she wondered if betrayal had been worth it. But pride silenced her. The children were not blind to the tension. Eli and Grace, living part-time under their mother's roof while the court process churned, began to notice the subtle shifts. Grace complained of cereal for dinner, of nights when her mother sat silently by the window with a glass of wine. Eli described Marcus's temper, how he snapped when the children made noise. They whispered these truths to Daniel on weekends, their voices trembling with the confusion of children caught between worlds. Meanwhile, at the garage, Daniel pressed on. Henry Caldwell barked his usual orders, and Kyle Sanders hovered like a restless shadow, eager to learn, yet wary of trust. Daniel found himself guiding the young man more intentionally. One afternoon, when Kyle botched a repair and cursed loudly, Henry stormed off, muttering about wasted time. Daniel placed a steady hand on Kyle's shoulder, his hazel eyes calm. "Don't let anger win," he said. "Mistakes are how we learn. What matters is what you do after." Kyle, lanky and defensive, looked away but nodded slightly. Later that evening, he brought Daniel a soda from the vending machine, his awkward way of saying thanks. Rook sniffed at Kyle approvingly, tail wagging once. In the basement apartment, Sarah Bennett continued her quiet role in their lives. She visited more often now, sitting with Grace as she painted or listening to Eli read aloud. Her tall, angular frame seemed less intimidating as the children warmed to her, and Daniel began to see in her a resilience he admired. One evening, she told him about the fire that had taken her partner years ago. Her voice cracked as she admitted she hadn't touched her paints since, afraid that creating beauty would only remind her of what she had lost. Daniel, listening with quiet empathy, told her, "Sometimes broken things can be rebuilt stronger." The words lingered between them, both aware he wasn't just speaking of art. The cracks in Claire's life grew wider. At a high-end restaurant where Marcus had once been welcomed like royalty, the manager quietly informed them that their account was overdue. Claire felt heat rise to her face as whispers echoed from nearby tables. Marcus dismissed it with a forced laugh, but his clenched fist told another story. That night, when they returned home, Claire's patience snapped. "Tell me the truth," she demanded, voice trembling but resolute. "What did you drag me into?" Marcus's eyes darkened. He did not shout, but his silence was heavier than anger. Finally, he said, "The only mistake you made was thinking Daniel Harris could give you anything. He's a nobody. Without me, you're nothing." The words sliced through her. For the first time, Claire glimpsed not a savior, but a predator. That weekend, when Daniel picked up Eli and Grace from the daycare, they clung to him more tightly than usual. Eli whispered, "I don't like it there, Dad. He scares me. Mom cries a lot." Grace nodded, burying her face in his shoulder. Rook whined softly, sensing their distress. Daniel's resolve hardened. He knew the inheritance locked away could tip the scales, but for now, he chose another path, documenting everything. He began keeping meticulous notes of what the children said, the bruises he suspected, the meals skipped. He carried his foster father's legacy not as a weapon yet, but as a promise. And across town, in the polished house that smelled faintly of decay beneath its perfume, Claire stared at her reflection again. For the first time, she no longer recognized the woman looking back. The morning of the preliminary custody hearing dawned gray and unforgiving. Ashford's courthouse, a brick building capped with a white steeple, loomed against the storm-heavy sky like a relic of solemnity. Rain slicked the steps, umbrellas dotted the street, and the flag out front snapped restlessly in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with whispers and the faint scent of old wood polished too many times. Daniel Harris stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, his suit borrowed from Vincent Morales, slightly too tight at the shoulders but pressed clean. He had shaved carefully, his hazel eyes clear, though lined with exhaustion. Beside him sat his lawyer, Robert Parker, a man in his late 40s with thinning sandy hair and sharp features, softened by a perpetual air of weariness. Parker was not the kind of lawyer with theatrics. Instead, he had a reputation for patience, precision, and an uncanny ability to disarm opponents with calm logic. His brown eyes, framed by half-moon glasses, held a flicker of reassurance as he looked at Daniel. "You've documented everything," Parker said quietly, his voice steady. "Expenses, notes, even the daycare's records. That matters. Today isn't about money, it's about stability." Daniel nodded, his hands tightening on the folder he carried. Inside were the notebooks he had filled each night. Grocery lists, receipts, notes of the children's words. Each line felt like a battle fought on paper. Rook lay at his feet, allowed in the building only by exception because he was registered as a service dog. The German Shepherd's amber eyes scanned the hallway, body alert, as though he understood the gravity of the day. The doors opened and the bailiff called them in. The courtroom was modest, polished wooden benches, portraits of past judges lining the walls, and the state seal glimmering above the bench. Judge Margaret Davis, a woman in her 60s with silver hair cut into a bob and a gaze like cold steel, presided. Known throughout the county for her no-nonsense demeanor, she had built her reputation on being incorruptible. She wore her robes like armor, her posture commanding, her lips pressed thin. Claire sat across the aisle with Marcus at her side. She wore a tailored navy dress, her hair styled to perfection, though beneath the facade, her eyes carried dark hollows. Marcus sat with smug confidence, his gray eyes darting around the room as if the outcome were already his. Their attorney, Alan Graves, a broad man with a booming voice and slicked-back blonde hair, leaned toward them, whispering. Graves was known in Ashford for his aggressive tactics, loud, forceful, always seeking to overwhelm with noise rather than substance. The children were not present, protected from the day's ordeal, but their absence was palpable. Daniel imagined Eli's worried frown, Grace's trembling lip, and his chest tightened. He fixed his eyes on Judge Davis as the proceedings began. Graves rose first, painting Daniel as an exhausted, underpaid officer who had dragged his children into poverty. His voice thundered through the chamber, words sharpened to cut. "Your Honor, my client has maintained a stable residence, while Mr. Harris forces his children to live in a basement apartment with mildew on the walls and no proper furnishings. This is not the environment of a fit guardian. These children deserve comfort, not hardship." Marcus smirked as the words echoed. Claire sat stiffly, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress, her expression unreadable. Parker rose slowly, adjusting his glasses. His voice was calm, almost quiet, forcing the room to lean in. Stability, Your Honor, is not measured in thread count or chandeliers. Stability is measured in consistency, love, and safety. Mr. Harris may not live in luxury, but he has provided his children with food, shelter, education, and care. His notebooks, meticulously kept, document every expense and every step he has taken. The children are thriving under his guardianship. What my colleague calls poverty, I call proof of devotion. Judge Davis's expression remained unreadable, but her eyes flicked toward Daniel's folders with interest. As the hearing unfolded, witnesses were called. Martha Reynolds, the daycare provider, testified first. She wore a floral blouse beneath a cardigan, her posture straight despite her age. Her soft brown eyes held warmth as she spoke. Eli and Grace are always clean, always fed. Their father picks them up early whenever he can. He works hard. I've seen children neglected before. These two are not. Graves tried to undermine her, pressing about the apartment's conditions. Martha's reply was simple. A child can sleep in a palace and still feel unloved. They are loved with him. Next came Henry Caldwell, the garage owner, summoned reluctantly. His wiry frame looked out of place in the witness stand, oil still under his fingernails. He cleared his throat roughly. The man works harder than anyone I've hired, doesn't complain, spends every break calling to check on his kids. That's all I'll say. Henry's blue eyes shifted away quickly, embarrassed by the attention, but his words landed solidly. Across the aisle, Claire sat rigid, her jaw tightening. Marcus leaned in, whispering harshly, and for a moment her hand flinched as though she wanted to pull away. When Daniel himself was called, he rose with steady steps. His testimony was simple. The details of his days, his commitment to his children, his vow never to let them feel abandoned. He did not mention the inheritance, nor the trunk, nor the shares of Apex Dynamics. That was a weapon held back for the right moment. As he spoke, Rook shifted at his side, eyes bright, tail sweeping once across the floor. It drew a faint smile from Judge Davis, perhaps the only crack in her stern facade that day. By the time arguments ended, the rain outside had turned to a steady drizzle, streaking the tall courtroom windows. Judge Davis announced she would review the evidence and reconvene in several weeks. No final decision was made, but Daniel felt the weight of the storm easing slightly. As they left the courtroom, Marcus muttered something sharp to Claire, his grip tight on her arm. She winced but said nothing, her eyes flicking toward Daniel for just a second, filled with something that looked like regret or fear. Outside, the courthouse steps glistened. Vincent Morales waited there, his tall frame hunched under a raincoat, arms crossed. He gave Daniel a nod of respect, then leaned down to pat Rook's head. "You did good," he said quietly. Daniel exhaled for the first time in weeks, with the faint sense that the truth had found its first foothold. The first snowfall came early to Ashford that year, drifting in thin sheets across rooftops and softening the edges of the streets. Daniel Harris returned to the basement apartment after another long shift at Henry's garage, his body aching but his mind sharper than ever. Rook padded in behind him, shaking snow from his black and silver fur, ears pricking at the familiar sound of Grace humming while coloring at the table. Eli was reading aloud from one of the library books Sarah had lent them, his voice halting but determined. For a moment, Daniel felt the fragile warmth of home. Though he knew it was temporary, custody remained unsettled, and the children still spent part of their time at Claire and Marcus's house. That night, after dinner of pasta and bread Martha had sent from the daycare, Daniel tucked the twins into bed. He sat awake long after, the trunk documents spread across the table, weighing whether to reveal the inheritance. Rook lay by his boots, occasionally lifting his head when the building creaked. Just past midnight, the phone on the counter buzzed. Daniel frowned. The caller ID read Eli. He answered quickly. "Eli, what's wrong?" The boy's voice came through in a shaky whisper, broken by muffled sobs. "Dad, please, can you come get us? Uncle Marcus is yelling again. Mom's crying. I don't like it here." Grace's faint crying could be heard in the background. a sound that clenched Daniel's heart like a vice. Daniel's hand tightened around the phone, his knuckles white. "Listen to me, son. You're safe tonight, okay? Stay in your room. Hold your sister close. I'll fix this. I promise." Rook stood suddenly, hackles raised, ears swiveling toward the sound of Daniel's voice as if he could hear the fear spilling through the line. The German shepherd let out a sharp bark, then pressed his head against Daniel's thigh, grounding him. The next morning, Daniel drove straight to Parker's office. Robert Parker looked older in the daylight, the dark circles under his eyes heavy behind his glasses. His suit jacket hung loosely on his narrow frame, as though the weight of too many cases had worn him down. Still, his eyes sharpened when Daniel laid the phone on his desk and played the recording he had made of Eli's late-night call. "This," Parker said, his voice quiet but firm, "is more powerful than you think. Not in a courtroom yet. It's hearsay. But combined with what we already have, it paints a clear picture." He leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. "The judge needs to see that Marcus is a danger and that Claire cannot protect them." Daniel rubbed his temples. "I don't want to use the inheritance yet. I want to win with truth." Parker studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Truth can win, but truth needs walls to stand on, a stable home, security. You have to act soon." Later that week, at the daycare, Martha pulled Daniel aside. Her floral blouse smelled faintly of soap, and her warm eyes were troubled. "Eli had an accident," she said softly. "He's 7 years old and hasn't wet himself here in years. But today, he did. Grace has been unusually quiet, too. Children carry fear in their bodies, Daniel. They're telling us something." Daniel's throat tightened. He crouched down to hug both children when he picked them up, whispering, "It won't always be this way. I promise." Rook wagged his tail gently, nudging Grace until she giggled faintly, a sound that broke the heaviness of the moment. Meanwhile, Marcus's behavior grew more erratic. In the polished but suffocating house, he barked at the children for spilling juice, pounded the counter when bills arrived, and left Claire trembling in silence. One evening, while Claire stood at the sink washing dishes, her hands raw from hot water, she caught her reflection in the window. The proud woman she once knew stared back at her like a stranger, eyes rimmed with red, mouth pressed tight. Marcus's voice echoed from the next room, smooth but edged with menace as he spoke into the phone about debts. Claire realized for the first time that she had chained herself to a man who valued control above love. In the basement apartment, Daniel leaned more on Sarah Bennett. Sarah, tall and angular, with her auburn hair tucked carelessly behind one ear, had become a frequent presence. She brought soup when she cooked, she watched the twins when Daniel worked late, and one evening she even laughed for the first time in years as Grace showed her a watercolor of Rook in heroic splendor. Daniel noticed how her face, usually shadowed with grief, softened in those moments. He admired her strength, the way she had survived tragedy without bitterness. One cold night, Sarah found Daniel still awake at the table, the trunk documents spread out again. She pulled up a chair, her long fingers tracing one of the faded letters. "This could change everything," she murmured. "But I know why you're afraid. Money like this, it doesn't heal wounds. It only magnifies them." She looked at him intently. "What matters is what you use it for. Don't let Marcus twist your life into another battlefield." Daniel met her gaze. "I just want my children safe." She smiled faintly, a rare warmth. "Then that's your compass. Follow it." The storm broke again days later. Another late-night call came from Eli, this time more desperate. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Dad, he yelled so loud. Mom didn't say anything. Grace is scared. Please, please come get us." Daniel's body shook with helpless rage as he promised his son once more to hold on. When the call ended, he sat in silence, fists clenched, until Rook nudged his arm. The dog's eyes glowed with fierce loyalty, as though saying, "You are not alone in this fight." Daniel knew then that he could no longer wait. The children were slipping further into fear. He would act, not recklessly, not with anger, but with the steady force of a father who had decided the storm must end. The days following Eli's desperate calls felt heavier, as though every corner of Ashford carried a silent witness to the children's fear. Daniel Harris no longer slept easily. Each creak of the basement pipes jolted him awake, every echo of a child's cry in his memory. Rook sensed his unrest, pacing the narrow apartment at night, nails clicking on the concrete floor, pausing now and then to press his warm head into Daniel's hand. Daniel's decision crystallized one evening as he spread the faded documents from the farmhouse trunk across the table. Grace and Eli were already asleep in their makeshift beds, their small chests rising and falling in fragile rhythm. Sarah Bennett sat across from him, tall and angular in the dim light, her auburn hair pulled back loosely. She was sketching idly on a scrap of paper with the crayons she had given Grace weeks ago. Her eyes flicked up, steady. "You've been circling this for too long. They need a home, Daniel, not just walls, but safety. That inheritance isn't a curse, it's a shield." He exhaled, fingers tightening on the yellowed stock certificates. "If I use it, Marcus will come after me harder. Claire, too. It'll be blood in the water." Sarah set her crayon down. "Maybe, but wolves already circle your children. What are you waiting for? For the storm to eat them alive?" Her voice was sharper than usual, edged with the bluntness of someone who had watched too much slip away in her own life. Daniel looked at her, seeing not just a neighbor, but a survivor. The next morning, Daniel walked into Parker's law office with the trunk documents under his arm. Parker looked up from behind his cluttered desk, his thinning hair askew, spectacles sliding down his nose. He was wearing the same suit as the week before, only slightly more rumpled, and a coffee cup that had long gone cold sat ignored at his elbow. His brown eyes widened when Daniel placed the documents down. "This," Daniel said, his voice low, "is my ace. Use it when the time comes. But not before." Parker flipped through the papers, his practice calm, faltering for once. "Good God," he murmured. "Do you understand what this means? These shares alone?" "I understand," Daniel cut in, "but I don't want to win on money. I want to win because I'm their father. Still, we'll need this to show them I can give my kids a real home." Parker nodded slowly, his voice regaining its steel. "Then we'll play it carefully. First step, a house, not a basement apartment, something undeniable." Over the next week, Parker introduced Daniel to a real estate broker, Janet Whitfield, a woman in her early 50s with cropped silver blonde hair, crisp navy blazers, and an energy that filled the room. Janet had been in real estate for decades, known for her blunt honesty and her ability to cut through pretense. She had a sharp gaze behind wire-rimmed glasses, but when she shook Daniel's hand, her grip was warm, her smile sincere. "Officer Harris," she said, studying him, "I've heard a bit about your case. You don't need extravagance. You need a place that breathes safety." She took them to see a modest two-story house on the edge of town, its white paint slightly weathered, a yard shaded by two ancient oak trees. The backyard opened into a quiet stretch of meadow, perfect for children to play. Grace's eyes widened as she spotted the swing set left behind by the previous family, while Eli wandered the hallways, running his fingers across the walls as if claiming them. Daniel walked through the rooms, the creak of the floorboards beneath his boots, Rook's paws padding beside him. For the first time, he felt air fill his lungs without weight. It wasn't a mansion, it didn't need to be. It was home. Janet's voice broke his thoughts. "It's on the market at a fair price. With what you've shown me, I can close this quickly." Her gaze softened. "You're not the first father who's come to me desperate to give his kids something better, but you might be the most determined." The purchase went through faster than Daniel expected, thanks to Parker's orchestration. Within 2 weeks, the deed was in his name. He moved what little they owned from the basement apartment, the children's books, Grace's watercolor set, Eli's stack of library treasures, the battered couch, and the old trunk. Sarah helped, her tall frame balancing boxes easily, despite her lean build. Martha brought over baked bread and blankets from the daycare. Even Kyle Sanders showed up after his shift at the garage, awkward but willing, his pale hair falling into his eyes as he carried furniture with unexpected strength. Daniel stood in the front yard that evening, Eli and Grace running barefoot through the grass, their laughter ringing against the twilight sky. Rook bounded after them, tail high, his deep bark echoing in joy. Sarah leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, her eyes shining faintly with something she quickly blinked away. Inside the house, Daniel placed the trunk in the corner of his new bedroom, resting his hand on its lid. His foster father's legacy was no longer just a secret. It was the foundation of their future. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus seethed. He had caught wind of the purchase through whispers. Janet's name had been mentioned in circles he monitored, and soon he knew. His debts were mounting, his influence slipping, and the thought of Daniel Harris, the nobody cop, succeeding enraged him. He slammed a glass against the counter, shards scattering, as Claire flinched from across the room. "He's nothing without me breaking him," Marcus spat. Claire said nothing, but in her silence, she felt the ground beneath her begin to tilt. The storm was far from over, but for Daniel and his children, the first rays of dawn had broken through the clouds. The morning of the final custody hearing broke clear and cold, the first true blue sky Ashford had seen in weeks. The courthouse steps glistened under frost, and a hush lingered in the air, as though the whole town sensed the weight of the day. For Daniel Harris, walking up those steps with Parker at his side and Rook trotting close, it felt less like approaching a building and more like approaching a battlefield. Only this time, the weapons were not guns or badges. They were truth, devotion, and the steady record of every sacrifice he had made for his children. Inside the courtroom, Judge Margaret Davis presided again, her silver hair gleaming under the lights, her gaze unreadable but sharper than ever. Claire sat with Marcus beside her navy dress perfectly tailored but her shoulders tense. Marcus wore his usual smirk, though his eyes darted restlessly, betraying nerves. Their attorney, Alan Graves, carried himself with the bombast of a man rehearsing lines too many times, his broad frame stiff in his chair. Parker laid out the case methodically. He presented Martha Reynolds, who testified with quiet authority about the children's regression under their mother's care, Eli's accidents, Grace's silence. He called Henry Caldwell, who spoke of Daniel's relentless work ethic. Even Kyle Sanders, pale-haired and fidgeting, appeared. Surprising Daniel, Kyle, lanky in an ill-fitting blazer borrowed from somewhere, told the court in halting words how Daniel had mentored him, how even when exhausted he found patience. "If he can steady me," Kyle said, "you can bet he steadies his kids." His voice cracked at the end, but it rang sincere. Then came the moment Parker had reserved, the unveiling of Daniel's ace. With deliberate care, he placed the trunk documents on the table, explaining the inheritance left by Daniel's foster father. He did not frame it as wealth for power, but as proof. Daniel had secured a stable home with a deed in his name, free of debt, with space and safety for the children. He submitted photographs of the house, white siding, oak trees, a swing set already waiting. Graves tried to thunder his objections, claiming manipulation, but Parker's calm voice cut through. "This is not about riches. This is about responsibility. While Marcus Bell squandered resources and built debts, while my client's children were left frightened in a house of shouting and silence, Daniel Harris built a life out of discipline, honesty, and love. He has provided not only shelter, but a future." Judge Davis leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Marcus. "Mr. Bell, do you have anything to say regarding the allegations of debt and household instability?" For once, Marcus faltered. His practiced composure cracked, his jaw tightening. He muttered something about temporary setbacks, but the courtroom had already turned against him. Claire's face drained of color. Then Parker played the doorbell camera. Footage. Claire hurling Daniel's belongings into the rain. Eli and Grace crying on the porch. Marcus standing behind her with folded arms, smirking. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Claire buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking, while Marcus's smirk vanished entirely. Judge Davis's gavel came down with finality. Custody is awarded to Daniel Harris, full and permanent. This court finds Mr. Harris has demonstrated not only capability, but devotion beyond reproach. The children will reside with him in the home he has secured. Daniel bowed his head, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd held. Parker placed a steady hand on his shoulder, and Rook gave a low chuff as if in agreement. Across the aisle, Marcus sat rigid, his control slipping. Officers entered quietly, one of them whispering about active warrants linked to his debts. As they led Marcus away in handcuffs, Claire remained seated, staring blankly, her life unraveling before her. Outside, the crisp air stung Daniel's cheeks as he walked down the courthouse steps. Eli and Grace ran into his arms, bundled in coats, their faces lit with relief. Grace's laugh rang like bells as Rook bounded around them, barking joyously. Eli whispered against Daniel's chest, "We're home now, right?" Daniel kissed the crown of his son's head. "Yes, son, we're home." The weeks that followed were filled with quiet rebuilding. The White House with oak trees came alive with the sound of children's voices. Martha visited often, bringing bread and blankets. Kyle stopped by on weekends, tinkering with the garage set Daniel built in the shed, learning not just about engines, but about family. Henry even appeared one evening with a set of tools, gruffly muttering, "Figured you could use these?" Sarah became a constant presence, her tall frame hunched over the table, as she painted again for the first time since the fire. Eli and Grace watched in awe as colors bloomed on canvas, their joy coaxing Sarah's laughter into the rooms. One Saturday, Daniel strung up a new swing under the oak. Grace squealed as Rook chased her back and forth, Eli climbing beside her, the two of them laughing so hard they nearly toppled. Sarah leaned on the porch rail, auburn hair catching sunlight, her eyes softened with something like peace. Daniel stood beside her, watching his children play, feeling for the first time in years that the storm had finally broken. Claire appeared once, weeks later, on the sidewalk outside the house. She looked thinner, her clothes less polished, her face marked by regret. The children hesitated when they saw her, then slowly walked forward. She knelt on the path, opening her arms. They hugged her briefly, warily. But it was a bridge, fragile, tentative, but real. Daniel stood on the porch watching, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding that forgiveness was a road his children would choose in their own time. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Daniel gathered Eli, Grace, and Rook into the house. He cooked dinner, told stories, and tucked his children into warm beds. The laughter of the day still echoed in the walls, the scent of Sarah's paints lingered in the air, and for once, peace did not feel borrowed. It felt earned. The storm had passed, and beneath the oak tree in the yard, the swing swayed gently in the evening breeze, carrying the sound of children's joy into the night. At the end of this story, we are reminded of something greater than ourselves. No storm is too heavy, and no night is too dark when we place our trust in God. What looked like betrayal and loss turned into a path toward redemption, safety, and love. That is the miracle of God's grace, working quietly in the background until the right moment arrives. In our daily lives, we face struggles that may seem unbearable. But just like Daniel and his children, we are never truly alone. God provides strength, sends people to help us, and opens doors we thought were forever closed. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need encouragement today. Leave a comment below telling us your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story of hope and faith. And if you believe in miracles, if you believe God is still working wonders every single day, write Amen in the comments. May the Lord bless you, protect your family, and fill your home with peace.